Alright, I want to talk about color for a minute. So this is mass chaos, and this is just a whole bunch of stuff put together in Photoshop. Check the other videos for how I did it, or if you're interested in laying over textures and playing with pictures off the internet, this is a good way to get started. But let's talk about color for a second. So if I got mass layers and all kinds of goofiness going on, here's a little cool thing. If I take a circle and I take that circle and fill it with any color, let's say blue for example, whoops, let's make sure that it's on a new layer, I fill it with a blue, and I turn it to a hard light, I got this. And wherever I put this in my layer format, what I can do here is go to image adjustments, and I can go to hue saturation, and I can rank up the lightness, and it just looks like this. Okay. Same with saturation goes. If I want a vivid blue, I can go like this, and then I can choose any color really. So what I think is, I'll look at the painting and I'll go, what would look good in this? What saturation level would this look good at? And I'll start picking out a color just for the simple fact that I like it. And then I'll play around with the idea that it doesn't have to be on that layer. That's what I'm talking about, chaos. You can drop this down to any layer, and it becomes a little different for every layer that you drop it down. And then if you don't like it as much, you could blur it and Gaussian blur it, and then it just becomes a spot of color at that point. What I want to talk about is tinting things. So there's a lot of mass chaos here and a lot of different colors. But if I want to tie something all together, if I just fill this document blue, what would that do? Well, if I took this and I lowered it down, mass chaos, and then I'm starting to tie and integrate some color into it, but I'm toning it back. Oil painters used to do this. What they did is, they had a whole bunch of oil paints and they put it down, started going to town on it, but at the end they would find that it might not be appropriate to do that, and they took it and tinted it using one very thin layer of oil paint that's totally thinned down, more oil than paint, and then they could tint everything or tone it down. And you can definitely use these as what we can't do back then. What we couldn't do back then is, we couldn't say, hey, we're going to use that as a multiply layer, because if we could, that would have been an amazing transition of art. So that's a tip. If you find yourself going too overboard with things, put a tint over the top of it. Another thing is to tweak it outside of what we know as real color. We look at color every day, and we have this human vision, not this computer vision. And you see the mode here is RGB color. Well, that's cameras, that's robots, that's mechanical. This is hand mixing inks together to produce color. But then we have what we know as color as humans, lab color. So let's go to the lab color for a second and say don't flatten. I'm just going to show you a few tricks. It's what this series is all about. So just a few tricks. And you're like, wow, what just happened? That's an amazing transition from something that was just okay to crap. So obviously something went wrong there. So what I'm going to do here is first go in and edit copy merged. and then edit paste. Then go into lab color. The reason being is lab color doesn't understand layers at all. Sometimes these layer informations don't apply in lab. Look how some of these are lightened out. So the only way to use lab effectively is flatten all your layers into one, and that's how I did it. I went edit, copy, merged, and then edit, paste, and then pasted all these things on one layer. And now what I can do is use lab. And you can see some of these are grayed out because I'm using lab. So lab is not something you want to design in. Lab is something that you want to tweak stuff in. Let's go to curves. Without getting too technical into it, I've got technical variations of lab and how lab really works, but I would say what we want to do is tweak the A and B channel. So let's go to A channel and just tweak it. And what we have to do is counterbalance that with the other side. So whatever space that you see here, you should always counterbalance it with its equal space on the other side. Let's go to B channel. Let's tweak out that. And if you want, we can go into brightness and contrast or levels. And I can up the contrast of this document. Brightness and contrast actually functions quite well in lab. If you use RGB with brightness and contrast, it will just destroy pixels. Lab, however, if you look over lab, lightness, black and white values live on one channel, and then color live on two other channels. So actually, just by turning these colors on and off, I can get some different variations because I'm turning a huge section of the spectrum off just by going over here to channels. So lab is pretty amazing how that works because lightness is separate from color. Where RGB, that's not the case. So I would play around with these levels and brightness and contrast, and you'd be surprised what kind of effects you can get if you're more of want something dark and steamy into the background. That's how you do it. And look I got some of these blues popping out. These are imaginary colors, and that's why it looks pretty amazing, is because the spectrum of lab is just so huge that it is outside what we see as humans when we add it and introduce it to Photoshop, because now the spectrum goes way beyond what we see or what we're accustomed to. But when you get done with it, you always have to go back to RGB color, because if you don't, I'm going to say don't flatten. If you don't, it's not going to print quite well, and it's not going to function in the web very well. Okay, it's because you wouldn't be able to save it as anything. Now I can save it as JPEG or anything, but lab you can't do that. So that's how that works. So tweaking out color, why you would use color, how you tint things back, and what imaginary colors are, all in one lesson. Have fun. On to the next lesson.